Good evening. Welcome to the podcast. Hi, this is Jake. I'm going to do a little bumper up front to sort of intro the show because I'm really happy with how this came out. I'm really proud of this episode that we just did with Brynn Nieboer from BP Lettuce, Generation Loss, and Breht from Revolutionary Left Radio and Red Menace. It's great, but I kind of went through all my notes and I realized I did something that I do from time to time. It's just a foible of mine, which is where I made a whole entire episode about something. It came out really well, and then I realized that at the end of it, I was thinking about it, that I kind of forgot to talk about the very first thing I wanted to talk about, which sort of provides context for this entire piece, this entire pamphlet by Lenin, What Is to Be Done, that we're going to talk about, which is the concept of liberalism, right? And the reason I wanted to shine a little light on it is because it's something that I remember when I was learning about all this stuff, I found really confusing because that word means something different to us in America right now than it did historically in its roots, and they're connected, but they're different. So when we talk about liberalism in terms of, Russia 100 years ago, or I guess a little more than 100 years ago, we're not talking about, voting for, Al Gore and being a libtard or whatever the fuck it means in America today. It's specifically a technical term that refers to representative democracy and then some of the civil liberties that arguably come from there. And the reason I was thinking about this specifically is because there was a controversy even, you might say, on the internet a while back, about a piece that came out in Jacobin asking the question, something about liberalism. It was like, are we with it or against it? I don't remember what the exact headline is, but I thought it was interesting because people argued about it, and people that are, more on the Marxist side of things were like, of course we're not. And then I think a lot of people that are maybe like, a little bit of a softer centery side said, well, how the hell are we not? And the question, or the answer to that question, I think lies historically in around the era that we are going to be talking about with Lenin's rise and this thing he wrote in 1901. So historically, just to give you a little backdrop, when all this was happening, there was a czar that Lenin and his opponents here, the economists, were trying to beat, right? And he was an autocrat and a dick, and everyone hated him, right? And, well, not really, but Lenin sure did, and the economists, right? And so the thing about what they had, though, at the time is it did have some sort of form of representative government, and it looked a little bit like what we have today, but not quite. So where that comes from is like, if you look at like the end of the French Revolution, that was not a Marxist revolution, right? The French Revolution ended with these people sort of coming up with this idea of like, oh, okay, we can give like, these bourgeois leaders a say in the government. So the guy who's the best farmer is now in charge of fucking making decisions about farming and shit. And the guy who's the best gamer is in charge of gaming, etc. Right? It goes on from there. That's not like what we have today, where we vote for people and theoretically you can be a dishwasher living in the Bronx and fucking run for president or whatever. In Russia at the time, they had what was more easily identifiable as this bourgeois representative government that a lot of people, namely these people that he's naming as the economists, would argue you can do Marxism through running like your little AOCs through there, right? And what a lot of Lenin is identifying when he picks apart these arguments towards doing Marxism through liberalism is that liberalism itself is not inherently democratic. It's kind of got a way of always curling back around and being a tool for the rich and the establishment to control us. It's inherently dynamically set up that way. It will never allow revolution to happen to get us into a phase, known as communism, in which everyone's needs are met more egalitarianly and more fair, right? And so in Russia, it's really easy to look at, picture in hindsight and go, yeah, no, only fucking super rich bourgeois, people could be in electoral government. But nowadays, people go, no, look, we have democracy in America. We have an advanced form of liberal electoral democracy where everyone can run for office and stuff. And I guess what you need to understand, I guess the argument I would make on the Marxist side of this is that it's it's just a more streamlined version of a thing that has the same inherent structural problem, which is that it will never give everyone what they need. And we'll get into how that, how that argument plays out and how that affects other things in the show when we get to the middle of what is to be done. But just so you know, when he's arguing with these people and we refer to them as liberals, this is the argument against, the path of liberalism. All right, that was my little spiel. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, 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 not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Pod Damn America, the podcast for the idiots. I forgot what our name is. Hello, I'm Jake Flores. Alex Patak is here.
Hey everybody, let's do a show.
Anders Lee is here.
Comrade Lee here.
And joining us, we have two special guests this week from Beep Beep Lettuce, Brynn Nieboer.
Hello.
And from Rev Left Radio, Brett O'Shea. Welcome to the show.
Hello, happy to be here.
Happy to have both of you to help us talk about this specific piece of theory we're going to get into today. It's a theory episode, so depending on which one of our fans you are, you're either really happy or you're really mad at us, or you're gonna be mad at us afterwards because we're talking about a thing that's going to piss you off. But
we're all revisionists.
Mm-hmm. But we wouldn't be the show we are if we didn't just hammer right into that shit. So yell at me on Twitter. I don't care. I wanted to talk this week, I think it's actually Alex brought it up, about the pamphlet that Lenin wrote called What Is to Be Done, which came out in 1901. I said it like it was a fucking album.
When did this drop, Jake?
Yeah, new pamphlet dropped.
You had to refresh the podcast feed a few times, but eventually 1901, it was on there.
Yeah.
Supposed to be 1900, but they had some tech issues.
Yeah.
It got pushed back.
It starts with Lenin saying, "Sorry, the pamphlet's late. Please don't unsubscribe." But obviously, when we talk about theory, right, from a fucking 100-something years ago, the point of it is to glean some sort of parallel, right? And things are happening in the world. A lot of people don't understand what's happening in the world right now. And history, what is the phrase? It doesn't echo, but it rhymes, right? Yeah. Well, maybe
George Lucas.
If you don't understand what's happening in the world right now, listen, right? And you might hear history rhyming its ass off like a fucking rapper, all right?
Like a Seussical the musical.
Yeah. It's the history is the Grinch. Let's just bring it back to the Grinch.
Yeah.
That's basically the premise. I wanted to read this anyway. Somebody brought it up. I thought, hey, this is all perfect. Brynn and Brett, I know, are pretty smart when it comes to Lenin. So I figured we'd kind of walk through it, and you guys could help us kind of understand it in regards to what was happening back then and how that relates to what's going on today. So please, Brynn, I guess, why don't you start with what maybe that all kind of makes you think about?
Okay. It seems, as we enter the 20s, we've got a lot of things going on where we had a big sort of movement in the imperial core towards you know, social democracy, and a big push that failed with Bernie Sanders. And now it feels like as the pandemic has happened and we, you know, have these big movements toward anti-police brutality and, you know, Black rights, it just feels like it reminds me a lot. I mean, from what I understand, this is nothing compared to the 60s, but it does feel like there's something in the air that like people want upheaval, people want change, especially in this country, but all over the world. You know, India had one of the largest strikes in history, I think, like 250 million people. And so I think at this point, it seems like there's a lot of people doing what Lenin is complaining about, which is sort of being opportunistic, leading us back to liberalism, trying to do reformism, and tailism, etc. And it seems really relevant to figure out, well, what are we supposed to do? Because I think a lot of people forget to really ask that question and just say, well, we have to do something. So let's use the structures that are here. So I think it's a great idea to revisit this very important book that I read a long time ago. It was nice to reread it again in preparation for this episode, because it's like you said, it rhymes. It's very, very relevant to some of the stuff that's going on right now.
Totally.
Right. When I pitched the idea for this, I admittedly had not read the book yet, but I just thought the title was a really great title. What is to be done? That's a fire title. It's the first question you ask in the morning. You wake up, you say, what is to be done? You do it. And what is now, this very year, but the morning of the revolutionary future?
Well, it's the first year of a decade, you know, there's that. So before we kind of get into that, and also I'm going to talk about the title a little bit, Brett, do you have any sort of opening statements on talking about this piece of theory?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, just to echo a lot of what Brynn was laying down on the table, we're living in a time where, you know, we have a huge wave of reaction, but we also have an awakening, especially among younger people, especially among, you know, people who were previously liberals, a leftward shift as the center falls out of American politics. We see movements, and I'm sure we'll get more into this, like Black Lives Matter, expressing this spontaneous and completely justified, you know, just deep yearning to stop being killed by police, to have an equal participation in this country, to end mass incarceration, a huge amount of problems and a huge amount of energy in the face of those problems, but a complete sort of lack of real organizational focus. And this has happened, you know, all throughout history. Lenin was dealing with it in his own time, in his own context. We're dealing with it again. What makes this a little different is a couple variables. One, we have climate change, right? It's putting a sort of limit on how much time we actually have to get our shit together. And two, we're living in the belly of the evil empire, right? We're living in the legacy of the Cold War, of the deunionization of Reaganite and Thatcherite neoliberalism. And so the left in this country is really trying to find its feet again, right? We had some previous iterations of left-wing politics, the Wobblies, the CPUSA, the Black Panther Party, and a lot of that was crushed. It was whitewashed away. We weren't taught about it in school, and we're trying to find our feet once again. And so, you know, even though it was written well over a century ago, everything that Lenin is arguing for is just as relevant today as it was back then, although, you know, this book is obviously couched in so much inner Russian squabbling and whatnot. Some of the history can be a little confusing, and it's not super relevant. It's pulling out the theory that Lenin presents us, which, as I think we should keep in mind going forward, was actually put into practice later in the Bolshevik Revolution and proven to be efficacious and to be effective and to be superior to these other forms of organizing that Lenin is critiquing. So for so many different reasons, it's important and relevant to us today.
Right. The fact that it was actually proven true is what makes this extremely relevant, because this is something that's written during a period of a bunch of people kind of arguing with each other. And if someone else had won, their paper may have been something that we would be talking about right now. But this obviously sort of solidifies the concept of, you know, scientific socialism or whatever. It's repeatable, right? It's provable.
It's a diet that works.
Yeah, as I read this again, it just, especially the first chapter where he's sort of just like dunking on other people and being like, you're wrong for these reasons and you're wrong for these reasons. It really felt like reading someone's like Medium posts or Twitter thread and just being like, well, this guy is actually really right because he went on to like actually do the revolution. And I think whoever that is, you're still going to look back at their Twitter posts and be like, yeah, I guess they were right.
This really does feel like a post because, first of all, it's technically a pamphlet, and then you start reading it and you're like, this is like a book. This is literally like when you're watching someone post on Facebook and you're like, you're writing a novel. Like, you just are going off about one concept, because it's not like it's one thing that's 100 pages. But
how many more times do you have to hit the read more button to get to the end of what is to be?
Yeah, if you were friends with Lenin, he would definitely be one of those guys where you're like, oh, Jesus, another one.
That's all you talk about, man. But it's all he talks about.
Let's talk a little bit about the historical context of him writing this. So, because, you know, if you do sit down to read this, like if you're listening to this and you go, I want to read this, it will be kind of dense and opaque because there's a lot of vocabulary you'll have to look up and you go, who the fuck are the economists? Who's Plekhanov? Who's fucking, what's the Zemstva and all this shit? And that's not really important. Like, if I would suggest to anyone that really wants to to get their head around this, if you don't have that context, a really quick-ish way to do that is to probably listen to Mike Duncan's Revolutions series on the Russian Revolution, because he does provide a lot of context and explain who all these specific factions are and stuff. But really, if you just want to get the point of it, it's the details are, you know, the trees and the forest is the fucking ideology, right? So not entirely important. We can decode a little bit, but just to kind of put some context to it. So 1901, I think, and I'm probably getting this blurry because I'm a student, I'm new, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, yell at me or whatever. That's why I have experts here, right? But it seems to me that what's going on, the reason that there's these different factions of Marxist thinkers as... So Lenin's, you know, obviously a radical Marxist and is what is defined at this moment and in this paper as a social democrat. That doesn't mean the same thing as what it means now in like Europe or whatever, like a fucking sock dem, you know. Means he's more of a revolutionary Marxist. And he's been like in and out of Siberia for being Lenin. And I think the way this sort of plays out is that he gets back and there's been a tendency of Marxism, or at least one that's sort of masquerading as Marxism, that's sort of gaining a lot of steam and a lot of confidence in people, known as economism, which is essentially it's one that proposes that there's an electoral path for Marxist reform, and that also trade unionism is this big is the thing that we should all focus on. And they sort of limit their revolutionary theory to the trade unions and the idea that these like union secretaries will rise out of it and sort of become the representatives of unions, and then they'll affect things from there on. But they have a lot of interesting ideas that he breaks down. We'll get to. A lot of them involve just letting this sort of stuff happen spontaneously and not really organizing a party to, form a cohesive revolutionary push against the Tsar.
Right. He basically, I from what I understand, it seems like, and Brett, tell me if I'm wrong about this, economist is he's like being a dick. Because he's basically calling people who are like, oh, these people just want $15 an hour. These people just want like better wages. These people just want like reforms. And so he's calling them economists, and sort of I don't know if it was necessarily something they called themselves, but it was sort of he was basically saying, you guys are being reformists. You're not actually trying to change people's relationship to the means of production. You're not trying to make a dictatorship of the proletariat. You're just trying to like make people's lives slightly better under capital or, liberalism or whatever it kind of was at the time.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, as you're saying, he's basically calling them reductionist, right? You're reducing a full critique of all society down to just its economic components. You're reducing socialism to the mere sort of, bargaining over wages and the employee versus boss relationship. And he wants to zoom out and say our critique of capitalism goes well beyond just that relationship, right? It's a critique of the political, it's a critique of the cultural, the historical, and we have to have theoretical coherency guiding this movement. And that's another arena of struggle that we have to operate on, which economists or trade unionists or whatever would like to push aside and say, no, we actually don't have to focus that much on theory and theoretical guidance. Just let the masses do their thing, and we'll jump in and really not lead them, but be absorbed by them, right? And I think that's what he's really calling them, reductionists and opportunists and a bunch of other things, but that's what they are.
So he notices this split in thinking, which sort of later on will become Bolshevikism and Menshevikism, and he decides to write what is essentially like a diss track. This entire thing is just a dressing down, a fucking roast of, what we can sort of understand as like liberals who are presenting themselves as like, we're also Marxists. This is also Marxism, Marxism was being interpreted a lot of different ways at the time, and a lot of people were dragging it further and further to the center. So he sort of lays this down to go, once and for all, let's examine this. Let's figure out what's the difference here between these two things, and let's like sort of put this to rest, like not do this, or make it an ideological case for actually the way he thinks that things should be done. And then, something that's very funny about it is that he names it after this novel that he liked. So the reason it's called that is because there was this novel called What Is to Be Done that his generation of radical Marxists all like read when they were teenagers. Does anyone know like more about this? I've never read the book or anything.
I only found out about that sort of researching this. I never heard that it was named after like a little thing he liked.
It's about like a bunch of disaffected youth, like punk kids or something. But,
Oh, sick.
It's I was reading a little bit about it. Yeah, it's Churyevsky or something like that, who historians have described as a populist, quote unquote. But the novel, I believe it's looked back on in like the canon of Russian literature as being sort of like corny or like kind of like a young adult novel. But I think it's about a woman who leaves a troubled marriage, an abusive marriage, and forms like she becomes part of a utopian community. So it's sort of like planting the seed a little bit of the Soviet, which comes into existence later on. So and it was a very influential novel, despite its literary qualities or whatever. The one comparison I've seen from historians is Uncle Tom's Cabin in the U.S. as sort of like a social novel that like activated people to fight slavery at the time. But I guess
I love that because it also means that if the parallel is complete, there will soon be a hit podcast or album drop named Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're all going to be listening to and be like, you have to really hear what Uncle Tom's Cabin to get it.
Maybe, yeah. Well, I'm trying to think of like what the modern parallel would be. Like I think like Avatar, maybe. Like some
Titanic
action movie but something that has like a germ of revolutionary zeal to it that inspires like a generation to The Matrix.
It would be funny if Bernie Sanders just wrote like a fucking manifesto and it was called like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo or something.
I remember he had that book. He had a book that came out that was like, Where Do We Go From Here? And I was like, that's a total lift from What Is to Be Done. Like he definitely did that intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
and that work of literary fiction arose out of these previous decades of Russian agitation, Russian anarchism, Russian terrorism. I mean, Lenin's older brother was put to death by the Tsar for a sort of conspiratorial anarcho-terrorist plot against the ruling elite. So that book in some ways he's attaching his current sort of ideas and struggles to this previous several generations of Russian struggle and like this slow clarifying of ideas and strategies to move forward with. So it's all connected in that way.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Oh, it's very artistic. It's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then let's dive right into What Is to Be Done and sort of talk about his critique of economism. So The first thing he grapples with is this concept called freedom of criticism, which is it's a tricky phrase because I think what it is the economists are accusing the social democrats of wanting something called freedom of criticism, as if, to say like, well, this is unfair. You think you should be infallible. You shouldn't be able to be criticized or whatever. But that's actually a sort of tricky way of reframing the situation. Can anyone kind of shed some light on this? I'm kind of a little hazy on it now that I think about it.
Yeah, freedom of criticism is basically the liberal. I mean, the way to think of it is basically the liberals saying purity politics.
Right.
Like they're saying you can't accept our big binders full of plans to get a means tested healthcare because you want purity politics. Basically saying like, let us, we're free to criticize you. And you're being like, no, that's not what Marxism is. That's not what communism is. And they're like, well, what if we say it is? And so he's being like, that doesn't make any sense. And sort of, it's funny because I was thinking a lot about how we get sort of in the muck even now about things like purity politics, things like black pilled and all these like dumb words that like are just clear, obvious, like obfuscations of like liberals trying to take revolutionary potential away from people and like basically moving the goalposts all the time. And this is exactly, he spends like a good fourth of this book just explaining to people why that's stupid and why that's not revolutionary. It's counter-revolutionary. But obviously to us, we've never heard that phrase and we don't care. But I do think it's a good example of like why it's important. Because if a lot of people can be like, oh, you're being elitist, oh, you're being like a puritanical person just because you have this like ideological purity, and that works. That's worked in like in 1902, and it works in 2020. So I think he's saying like you have to be very clear that there's no freedom. Freedom is an important word to be talking about, but freedom to be a reactionary or freedom to be on the right of me isn't anything. That doesn't mean anything.
Right. Freedom to sort of still call yourself still call what you're doing Marxism while it's not really defined by the defining characteristics of it. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really, and another way to think about this is in the face of Marxist ideological coherency, there's this group of people, right? These rad libs, if you will, whatever you want to call them today, these opportunists. And they're saying, you Marxists are too dogmatic. And under the guise, the Trojan horse of freedom of criticism, they're trying to usher in a bunch of liberal, eclectic ideas that actually dilute Marxism and therefore hinder the ability for this working class movement to progress and make actual material means. It's all under like, it's my free speech to stand up in the middle of the meeting and just say whatever dumb shit comes to my mind,
Yeah.
And Lenin is like, no, let's be principled. Let's think through. We have to have theoretical coherency if we want to make any advancements whatsoever. And so, fuck your freedom of speech. Let's do this, And
I think one thing I wanted to point out in context of this book is that like Edward Bernays hasn't happened yet. Like fascism hasn't happened yet. Like the idea of like really getting at these sort of weird like marketing terms and like understanding really deeply why they're reactionary or pulling people to the right or the center or whatever is way out of people's understanding. And that's why it's really important in this book that he's like, these people are dragging you into a marsh. We're going into the muck. And like, we're just going to say, hey, we're letting go of your hand. Like, you're not with us. And I think now we should have enough clarity to say, look, we saw the Nazis do it. We saw Edward Bernays do it. We've had almost a century of PR and propaganda. You have to recognize when someone is just using terms to take away, your focus.
Yeah, kind of like a few years ago when reactionaries were all about free speech, right? It was very clearly not free speech. Like, you don't want communists coming on CNN and giving our views. It was a Trojan horse for them to get through their reactionary politics, not have any accountability for the crazy dumb shit that they were saying. So it's similar to that, but inside a left-wing party.
Yeah, there's like an obviation there. This also kind of reminds me of when like Bernie ran in the primary and there were just like, they just like packed the field around him to sort of create this idea that like, this implication that what Andrew Yang is doing and what Elizabeth Warren is doing are all, these various gradients that are like on a scale similar to what he's doing.
Progressivism.
Yeah, and that would be defended as like, no, it's just a criticism of what he's doing, but it's fundamentally different.
Right, it's a more practical version of getting to the quote unquote same place as he wants to go.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Very similar type of strategy. I mean, the strategies don't really change, and once you sort of like read stuff like that, you're like, or this book, you're just like, oh, they're always going to do the same thing. It becomes easier to spot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, this entire thing, I mean, one of the most useful applications of this book, I think, as it applies now, is just like you could also just rename it like How to Deal with Liberals. Because they are going to be around forever until you've destroyed capitalism.
Liberalism. Didn't Ann Coulter write a book that was like Liberalism is a Mental Disorder or something like that?
Michael Savage wrote
Michael Savage. And that's another Lenin work as well about left communism, I think, as an infantile disorder. I think I don't think that was a coincidence either.
Wow. Let's move on a little bit and talk about another thing that he identifies called tailism. I think there's a lot to sort of pick apart here.
Yeah.
So the economists sort of keep pushing this idea of focusing on the trade unionists, right? And that being the thing that's going to drive, the revolution that they supposedly are also really, really trying to make happen, right? They're kind of bullshitting you about. They talk a lot about spontaneity. I guess we should sort of like lump in these two concepts, and because that's going to kind of overlap with a lot of things that he's criticizing here. There's this big economist concept that the workers and the trade unionists will spontaneously sort of activate themselves, and it's it's not good. It's not to be done to try to agitate them from at the outside, right? What you have to do is follow their lead. And Lenin's going to argue with this a lot and take a more active approach and sort of point out how, that doesn't really work and how it's very condescending. And, you're also not really like condescending to workers when you in the intelligentsia come and like offer a plan to sort of synthesize with them. Everyone's in it together when you do that. But the way the economists are describing it, makes it sound like, you're this like outside agitator, right? And for that reason, the Leninist approach would be, not to lead them, but to work with them. And the economist approach is this thing where you're like, no, you drag behind and you follow where they go. I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's two things that I would start off by saying, drawing parallels to today's political situation. One is these folks are looking at Lenin and his comrades and basically making the authoritarian argument, right? Like by advocating for a vanguard party, you are these authoritarian elites who want to take over organic workers' movements and lead them or bend them to your own will. And instead of that, what we want is just to simply, let them do their own thing, and then we can maybe assist, jump in. And what Lenin says is you actually end up falling behind them, right? And then the other thing is this condescension claim where they're saying, to the Leninists, if you will, although that term's not around yet, you're being condescending. And Lenin flips that around. He's like, actually, you are with all this. It's kind of like today how we hear people say like workers can't read theory, right? We have these big debates on Twitter.
It's classist.
Yeah, it's classist. You're being condescending. And Lenin's flipping that around. Like, you're actually not giving working people enough fucking credit. And in fact, a vanguard party would allow us to focus on educating people, bringing them up, and educating them with theory while also being informed by their day-to-day struggles and their political machinations. So it's stuff that we still see today with the Occupy movement, for example. example, right? You can look at Occupy and see that's a spontaneous movement. And it was very inherently suspicious because it came out of anarchist circles. It was very suspicious of not only leadership, but of any sort of vertical decision-making whatsoever. And what you ended up with is this consensus decision-making where a bunch of strangers in a room are snapping their fingers to give, support or to take it away from any given plan. And what happens is that movement as a whole is unable to make coherent demands, unable to coordinate their activities from coast to coast, and eventually is utterly crushed by the state, co-opted and then crushed by the state outright. And Lenin is trying to prevent those things from happening to their movement at that time.
This is an important concept philosophically too, just in that the entire value of Marxist analysis is that it gives you a guide of where your role is in society. And if you are genuinely pushing for socialist revolution and a transformation of society, you're doing it as a worker. So to support and try to guide other workers and tell them, the things you've been learning that should be forwarding their interests is not elitism. It's just helping move the party forward.
Shout out to as a worker.
Yeah, shout out Sean.
Yeah.
Professional trade unionist. But no, I think that's really important. And you absolutely are continually seeing this today. And I think it is a similar strategy to divide the working class between elites, like people trying to say like people who went to college or people who have had time or an ability to educate themselves, whether through, bourgeois, whatever means, or just sitting down and educating themselves. Those people are now in a different class, according to these, these people who are trying to argue. But that's not true at all. And I think Lenin says here, that there's absolute value in people who have had the time and the privilege to do that, helping their fellow workers to organize. And that's why I find it really, insane how much we see this today. How much we see like, well, you can't educate the workers. That's classist.
Right.
That feels to me like the most kind of cop shit. And I think it's really important to read in this book why that is not true. And apply it to today, because I think the people who have the most ability to because Lenin talks about, it's not just saying, hey, look, I'm educated, your boss is robbing you, because they already know that. It's not commandism in that sense, but it's also like what we have to do is tie their problems to the broader spectrum of foreign policy, the institutional oppression of prison labor and capitalism as a whole. And that's the kind of stuff that, a random McDonald's worker or Amazon worker or Uber worker might not be able to tie together as like all a part of the same system. And that's people who have had the opportunity to read things like this and think about it. It's our their jobs to educate them on that.
Right. I think that argument has so much prestige today because there's kind of a dearth of working class party education, political education, whereas other points in history, it was much more common for there to be reading groups of working people discussing, things like Lenin. And that is still happening today. There are a lot of self-educated people, obviously, some of us are. But the conception for a lot of people is, if you learned all this stuff about history and theory, then you're, either rich or a debt peon to some university. Right. And of course there are bad ways to sort of try to educate people, right? I guess you could be condescending in the form that you sort of try to propagandize, but it's a really necessary thing to do in a political struggle is to have that grounding in Marxist theory and history. And that's the only way to do it. And this idea that people aren't capable of learning it is just selling people short. It's just not wanting to confront the necessity of education.
And I think it's just such a sleight of hand trick to imply that people who have read books are now elite.
Well, there's a lot of dumb people that have read books. Quite a few.
Yeah, they're not elite. Like people like that basically includes everyone, because we just read. Everyone here has read this book, and so we're all elitists now. And it's like that. It has not. It completely removes like an economic structure from the concept of elites. Like, we are not billionaires.
Right.
None of us have elitism. We are just people who read a book.
Yeah, there are some shades of gray here. Go ahead.
Often the most vociferous anti-theory people are really just giving voice to an insecurity that they have, right? They're sort of projecting their own lack of theoretical knowledge onto others and saying, yeah, they can't do it. And so I think there's some psychological dynamic there. But the important thing for sure is that it's a back and forth, right? There are some people who are going to be more intellectually equipped with theory, and there are going to be some people on the front lines in the workplace fighting. And you don't go to them and tell them anything, just like, you don't tail behind them, but it's this dialogue. It's this back and forth through you learn their everyday. It's almost like a proto version of mass line, right? It's like, you learn the daily struggles of this segment of the working class. You help enrich their understanding of the connections between their struggles and other ones. And, it's this constant dialectical back and forth. And I think that's what Lenin is ultimately advocating for.
Yeah.
It's also,
Dialectic.
Go ahead, Brynn.
Oh, and it's also so the argument is so individualist, right? Because they're talking about like, oh, this one person is going to walk up to a group of workers and then tell them all this. And it's like, what we're talking about is creating a revolutionary party. And there's going to be roles for vast amounts of people who've read and are educated and have like a theoretical foundation. And then people who are on the floor working or, driving or whatever the work is now. Like, it's not like they're all part of the same group.
Yeah.
That's the point. Separating them is anti-revolutionary.
He also talks a little bit about how this like division of labor actually cohesively probably has a better shot at getting a greater outcome for everyone involved in the party, as opposed to something like what he describes as like a primitive organization, which is the idea that like, when you work at a co-op and it's like everyone here is a stripper and also a DJ and you clean the bathroom, and it's like, no, you need specialists for at least one of those jobs, One thing I wanted to say about tailism is a little bit of a hot take. I'm going to preface it that way, I guess, is that I think that you might notice, you might identify this in liberals when they sort of talk on behalf of specifically like identity-based marginalized groups. There's a lot of like, how dare you speak for them or whatever. And that is a coded way of saying like, how dare you work together with those people, There's a quote, I can't remember who said it. It's going around today or whatever. It was about this black radical who wrote a book in the 60s, and he said that when you write a book about killing white people, they fucking sell it, and we write a book about uniting with white people to destroy capitalism.
Murray Baraka, yeah.
There you go, yeah. I also think, though, that when I think some of us on the left talk about like anti-wokeness and this idea that like you need to you're going to alienate working class people if you make an honest argument or a discussion about things that are identity based, which is real. It's just muddied with all the politics of it or whatever. You're going to alienate these people, right? And I think, to me, fucking hot take, and people are going to yell at me, I think it's a little bit of tailism, honestly. This thing where you're like, you can't have a dialogue with working class people about all the isms that make people mad on the internet, but I will leave it at that, and you can tweet at me. Another thing. Go ahead.
I think there's I forget who made this sort of analogy, but something the way I like to think about it is there's a difference between being 2 or 3 steps ahead of public opinion, which is, I think, where socialists need to be, and like 10 steps, like we should be able to have discussions about the society we want to achieve and where we want to go. But you also have to meet people where where they're at. That doesn't mean you stay where they're at, but that goes back to sort of the dialectic of organizing and understanding the framework they've been brought into and challenging it over time in certain ways. And I just think it comes down to like strategy, and some people are going to be ahead of others and as in their immediate understanding of how fucked the system is. And I think it is usually just a case by case thing.
I think
that's the lesson. I'm sorry, you go.
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's like the lesson of the year, right? I mean, if you look at all the Black Lives Matter stuff in May and June, and all these spontaneous uprisings that, happen when you have so much pressure going down in capitalism, they have wide support, huge support. Liberals who are capitalists are 100% behind them. And the reason is that they, from a socialist perspective, are doing a better job articulating some of the issues of the society we live in than, outright socialist groups are on a propaganda level, which is to say that the inequalities you're facing on a day-to-day isn't just that your boss makes more money than you or that your labor is being stolen. It's that it's manifested by murder in the streets. And people understand that. And they connect with that. And that gets them interested in the conversation more than explaining like the declining relationship of labor to capital over time, and so you have to be able to reach people where they are, but still be guiding them to get to that second point later.
Sure.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky because you see all these, sort of professional hack activists come in and guide them in a different direction. Yeah. And it sort of undoes the whole thing.
In fact, there are at least 100 Instagram models who are now like careerists from last summer. It's crazy.
Well, let's skip ahead a little bit and talk about that because I did want to kind of draw some parallels between, what's going on and what is to be done and the conversations around police violence, Black Lives Matter, and these, protests. I think there's some legitimate criticism of the Black Lives Matter movement from a Marxist-Leninist perspective in that, it is spontaneous. It is definitely what is being described here as, spontaneous, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just not the entire part of the equation, right? I think there have been some interesting hot takes about how it's not worker oriented, so it's maybe not moving in the direction of this, vanguard, this party or whatever. But I do think that it's definitely what Alex was talking about, which is a big sort of watershed of class consciousness, and the missing piece of the equation is to take this movement, in my mind, and then connect it to class consciousness and go, look, it's not that hard to explain. The police protect capital, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone who was involved in these protests could move from there and sort of contextualize. It's not necessarily a lost cause in my mind, but I'm open for discussion. So if anybody has anything to say about that, go right ahead.
I think what Mao and Lenin remind us is that when something fails to live up to a full revolutionary potential, it's not the fault of the masses, it's the fault of the vanguard elements. And so any Marxist-Leninist or anybody on that side of things that wants to look at BLM and just critique. Well, the reason that energy is funneled into spontaneity and not into organization is because the vanguard elements of American society haven't created an organization to take that really genuine, spontaneous energy, sharpen its edges, and use it as a spearhead for attack. That's our failure. You know, that's all of our failure. It's not the failure of the people themselves. They're rising up in spontaneous and justified reaction to just continued brutality. And so, there's this tendency to want to stand back and continuously critique when you realize the missing piece of the puzzle is precisely the level of organization that Lenin is advocating here. But it's not the fault of the people who are fed up by that they're getting killed by fucking cops in the street and do whatever they can. It's the fault of the left more broadly. And so always shifting that back away from the masses and putting that blame back onto all of us collectively, right, onto our shoulders, I think is the responsibility of revolutionaries and radicals.
And I think that you're absolutely right. And I've been saying, I remember back in the summer, I was talking about, I think somebody, maybe Amber said this, but like these kinds of things that happen, the BLM protests are a pot boiling over. Like when you put heat on water, it's going to boil. But what I was saying is that we haven't created a mechanism to funnel the steam and power an engine. at all. We have no mechanism whatsoever. And like, that's what it takes to actually do something, because it will simply just boil over and people will get caught in the flames and then it'll simmer down. And I think what Lenin here is saying is absolutely true. And this is what we were saying before, is that if you don't have, if you keep people from saying, oh, you're being elitist for wanting to create that structure, then you're just going to have this cyclical thing happen where the structure never changes. It's just continually brutally violent. And I think one of the things that people forget about this book is that Russia in 1902 was having continual famines. We were on the precipice of World War I. Like, there's so many like materialistic like horrors that were happening. As like the Soviet Union happened, there was like famines because of like, just because they've been happening, because they live in the fucking freezing desert of Russia. And like they had to create mechanisms to, lift people out of poverty. Like, people were at their lowest point, to the point that they were willing to die to create this new thing. And so I think when people look at, 2020 in the imperial core, I think we see a lot of similarly bad things happening. The fire is at a boil, and it is, I think, absolutely on us to be creating those machinations, that machinery to funnel that energy, or else we're all just going to get caught in the flames.
Yeah, you might say contradictions are heightened right now, right?
Yeah.
Very high.
Contradiction time.
It's contradiction
And we
time.
also see that in lieu of that level of organization and in lieu of that theoretical guidance, what happens in the Black Lives Matter movement is that because of the momentum and inertia of just regular liberal ideology, there's almost an inherent automatic default back to liberalism. It makes it much easier for liberal forces to co-opt the energy of Black Lives Matter, shift it away from actual material changes and into purely symbolic ones, right? Representation, street art, the fucking Pelosi wearing those African fucking fashion statements, like that. Yeah.
Oh my
That's what
God.
liberalism does. And Lenin is telling us it will do that every single time.
But not only that, the BLM leaders, well, first of all, some of them aren't even BLM leaders, obviously, D-Ray and all of these, in my opinion, CIA ops, like fucking get into this creation of like this totally separate thing that isn't even connected to the protests or whatever. But then real actual BLM leaders and people who are involved and actually do care, the only thing they know to do is enter the Democratic Party. Yeah. Because it's the only structure, the only machine that they understand how to affect any type of change at all for their entire life is the blue party, which has sometimes pretended to care about workers and Black people.
It's
people like
really
Cory Bush and AOC.
It's really confusing to take the streets, stop traffic, threaten police, march around for 5 or 6 hours, and then the march ends, and the last thing anyone says is the leaders going to the front and going, "Remember to vote Democrat," and you all go home.
Fucking insane.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. I get the anger. I don't know.
Another perfect example of this is when the NBA was going on strike. The media called it a boycott, but they were getting ready to go on strike. And guess what happened? They sent in arch neoliberal Obama to talk them off the ledge. We cannot have Black people and working people understand the power of strikes. And so he went in there, made it a symbolic thing, and stripped it of any material possibility of change. And that's what the liberal formation does every time.
Right. And I think, if we're just going to back to the sort of the standing on the sidelines thing, if we're just going to say oh, this is doomed to be a purely representational movement and we don't get involved, then that's going to be what happens. It's the job of revolutionaries and Marxists to get involved in the movement on the streets and try to push it in a material direction. I will say, I think in DC and in a lot of cities, there has been a push, and we'll see how this goes down, to actually take on the budget in these places and actually defund the police and redistribute the money there. And that's sort of a good step. But the question is, does it end with that? Is that just become an end in and of itself?
or are we actually grounding the redistribution in Marxist theory and in the history of Lenin, and actually building towards something greater?
Well, that dovetails pretty nicely with another critique of economism and what is to be done, which is he basically looks at economism as maybe a line of a tendency of Marxism that either on purpose or on accident fell into this pitfall known as tactics as plan, right? And you sort of see this with like new socialists, I think, a lot, where like, you know, you're not all the way out of the Plato's cave. And I mean, when you understand like the tactics, it's really exciting, but you might really think that the end all be all of socialism is going on strike or something like that, because they really, you know, focus a lot on the trade unionism thing in I guess what the economists were writing about. And that also is sort of like a pitfall when we talk about going the electoral route. A lot of liberals will make an argument that like that's how you do it, right? And it's like, no, this should be in service of this greater vanguard party movement. The only thing that can really possibly, you know, get the job done here. I guess tactics as planned is interesting to me because it's like something you can kind of get lost in. It's like it's an argument that the way he sort of describes it, I guess, is that when you reduce everything to just trade unionism and strikes and stuff like that, everything is still framed in the framework of you sort of being locked in conflict with your boss, right? So when you win a $5 pay raise or something, or fucking 5-cent pay raise or whatever, that's good, but you didn't break out of that dynamic, and that should be the end goal, or else they're just kicking the can down the road, right?
You're playing on a field set up by your enemies.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and this is interesting. I was just listening to an interview with Boots Riley, who was sort of giving like a breakdown of how what strikes and picketing and this kind of tactic used to be about was removing the production, right? Like you had to stop working. And that was a demonstration of the power you had as a group of people. And that's why they're called demonstrations. Like there was actually power in that, and it would cause actual problems. But as like the stratification of the working class happened, as the 70s happened, and like all of the radical leaders were murdered by the FBI, like the concept of picketing just became like, let's show that we're angry. And it would happen like on a weekend. And nowadays, like when you go protest, nobody's like taking off work to protest yet generally. Like one of the big reasons the protests happened this summer is that everyone was like during a pandemic. You know what I mean? And like, no, everyone's off work. We've got a high level of unemployment in America. And so but like, it's not actually hurting anybody's bottom line for you to go out in the street generally.
Dude, once those cops start dancing with you, they've reframed the entire fucking thing.
Yes, you know? but that's exactly my point, is that if you're just out in the street, how are you hurting anybody? Like, how are you hurting the money flow? How are you fucking with their money? And if you're not doing that, you're just pretending, kind of, you know what I mean? And it's like, I understand that people are angry and want to do something, and that's good, but if you're not doing anything, it's just tactics as the plan, you know?
Yeah.
And we should also understand
powerless.
There's been a century-long reaction specifically against even just trade unionism, because they realized it was a leverage point for people to actually, as you say, demonstrate their power. With McCarthyism and stuff, we saw the stripping away of radical leadership from unions. And then with the rise of neoliberalism, Reagan and Thatcher, we saw the decimation of unions and so that it really this long strategic assembling of one of the main levers of power for any oppressed people to fight back. And that's no accident. We find ourselves in the middle of the street with nothing to stop, you know, no real power to exert. That's exactly how they wanted it.
Yeah, that tactic was actually even too much, so they just took it away. And now we're still sort of talking a tactics as planned thing with like, oh, you run another AOC or whatever. You know, that's fine as a tactic, right? But it's not the plan.
And that kind of stuff saps energy too. Like people, lots of people we know, and some of us, like spend a lot of time canvassing for Democrats. And like, I mean, throughout my whole life, in 2008, I was like, well, I guess the best thing to do is vote for Obama and get people to vote for Obama. And like that kind of, no matter how sockdem or whatever the candidate is, it's a lot of time supporting a party that hates you.
I would push back on that a little bit. Maybe we'll get to this later on, but I think like I think a lot of times the broader left is very quick to dismiss DSA because of the party question. But there is, I think, a lot of interesting dynamics that are happening there that are sort of brushed over because of that. I mean, people will sometimes tiptoe around this about electoralism, but I think we should be honest, that is a big part of the strategy. And most of the candidates endorsed by DSA are using the Democratic line, but that's in service of building a party that is, I guess, not legally a party, but has its independent financing and organization from the Democratic Party. I think like in the context of today, a really good way, and so much of our ability to really form revolutionary organization and party has been crushed by the ruling class. But I think a way to sort of establish confidence with the working class and with the socialist movement is to make material gains through parliamentarism. I know people disagree, but I
don't disagree with that necessarily. I'm generally the DSA. I wonder, because I wanted to get into this, especially with you, Brett, because to me, the concept of the party form is something that Lenin really cares about. But to me, like the word party isn't as important as what a party does, which is not simply run in bourgeois elections, what I think is absolutely going to be necessary in an imperial setting like this. But also does all of the mutual aid stuff, does the organizing of workers, and does all of this kinds of stuff. And I don't know, the DSA might be doing some of that in some places. But whether they call themselves, what is it called? Is it an organization? I don't know what they even call it.
501c3. Yeah.
It's the world's first strand type game.
Well, that's what I was going to say, though, because I think that what differentiates DSA from like Justice Democrats or something like that is that to them, really reforming the Democratic Party, getting more progressive Democrats isn't an in and of itself. But the political education is happening alongside the reforms that we're winning in New York State. We now have tougher rent control laws. It's not, socialism, but it's something to establish a footing for further change and revolution. And there's also a lot of other stuff that's happening that's not electoral. I think the rank and file strategy is really important too. It's an effort to get members to join key industries. It's a certain amount of industries that we had a really vigorous debate about which industries to focus on that would put people in a strategic position to actually shut a city down. That this stuff is happening slowly, but it is grounded, I think, in more Marxist revolutionary thought than I think a lot of people give it credit for.
But I think that's at least partially about communication. It's difficult to say what they're doing, and I think what Lenin is saying here is that like it can't be that can't be the end, right? Like there's nothing wrong with getting more wages, better hours, no child slavery or whatever. Like there's nothing wrong with fighting for those things, but the plan has to be understood among the party leadership that what we are fighting for is the end of capitalism, is a revolution to put the workers in charge of the society.
And if go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
That's it. And if you lose sight of that becomes the problem. It goes back to this tactics as plan thing. And then also the idea, another critique could be, given that you're an organization, where actually do you put your time, energy, and funding toward? And if it's way too much towards electoralism in lieu of other ways to spend that energy, time, and money, then that can become a problem. And if electoralism becomes an end in and of itself, that can become the problem as well. But I've always advocated the fact that anything that makes life less miserable for working people should be supported. I was advocating for, Bernie to go out and vote for Bernie Sanders. Healthcare, all that stuff's important. But even I think just the knowledge generated by the fight, right? If Bernie actually got in, I think Democrats would expose themselves for what they are. Republicans would expose the system itself. The facade of democracy would start to slip, and that can be educational in and of itself. But when that becomes the end in and of itself, even if it's not conscious, it just sort of slowly and surely defaults to that. I think that is where a critique can be laid. But I see the DSA as I see all these formations. We're all imperfect, right? But it's everybody fighting the best way they know how on multiple fronts. And what else should we expect? It's almost like some radicals, some MLs and stuff are just like offended that the DSA even fucking exists. And it's like, well, what do you expect? There's going to be an entire spectrum of left-wing activity. We can advocate for our own, but it doesn't mean we need to like cut off and make enemies out of what Mao would call non-antagonistic contradiction.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and bang my gavel right now because I think the Tactics as Planned is a circular thing that really we could get stuck in because it's really, to kind of put a point to it, Lenin is not saying the tactics are bad. He's saying that reducing everything to just that and that is the end-all be-all of the plan is bad. And that applies to all this stuff, We kind of feel that way about every tactic, electoral stuff, unions, organizing, all that stuff. And also another tactic he talks about, terrorism. So this is a really interesting thing.
Now we make all the anarchists mad.
It's timely.
ISIS listeners, apologies in advance.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but also a bunch of
the brave soldiers and the Mujahideen.
A bunch of alerts just went off in the fucking Homeland Security guy. Computer that listens to this. So terrorism is interesting. It's timely for when he writes What Is to Be Done because he's coming off the heels of the era when you would throw big bowling ball bombs at czars and dukes and stuff. And it wouldn't, it would kill them, but it wouldn't maybe bring on the revolution. And so he's sort of he's talking about the limit to that and how it's a spontaneous act, right? It's something that someone just gets fucking fed up enough and they go, I'm going to just do it, right? And then they go and do it, and it has this backlash that kind of keeps the organizing from occurring. That's the critique here, is that it actually works against the ultimate party plan, right? And it's also, it's timely for our time because they burned a fucking police station down, right? And so a lot of people might look at Black Lives Matter and the protests and the riots and stuff like that as like having the same shortcoming. The big thing that you hear a lot, honestly, or at least I've heard a lot, is like that is going to turn people off, and so it can't happen this way. And then the person will either go, down the liberal road and say, so you have to vote, or they'll go down a different, like, left road and say you only can organize. You can't really do what is, happening that is being perceived, at least, as terrorism there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the tactics of terrorism, and also, I guess my counterpoint to it would be, we just did an episode about John Brown, and, he might be the only example of it sort of, not necessarily one-to-one directly causing something to happen, but catalyzing and heightening contradictions that were already in place in regards to a big situation where the mode of production could not sustain itself. Anybody have any thoughts on terrorism?
well, I'd say, just to be pedantic here, I don't really think that we should be considering John Brown as a terrorist, considering he attacked a military base.
That's fair.
But
and that's the same point you could make for the Black Lives Matter stuff too.
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. But I don't even know if I think Lenin is coming at this from a respectability sort of argument. I think more than anything, this is reminds me a lot of maybe last year. I think it was last year. There was a guy who shot up an ICE facility. I don't remember if I remember that, but he sort of knew he was going to be his last act and wrote basically a suicide note, and then shot up an ICE facility. And I feel
he just really wanted to wear a sombrero. He read Jake's joke.
He's heard this joke on the internet.
He was like, if I make it through this, I'm going to call myself Speedy Gonzalez. But no, I think that I don't. At the time, my feeling was in a sort of like, in the spirit of Leninism, is that, sure, man, that's cool. I'm glad, I feel your pain, but it's not that I think it's bad for the movement, because no one is going to be like, well, I guess ICE is good now that somebody shot up ICE, but that it doesn't really do anything. It isn't functionally, it's not a strong move, right?
Exactly.
Against the ICE as a structure. What he should be doing is trying to, not to, RIP and everything, but it would have been more, the play would have been better. The offensive play would have been more likely to have succeeded if he was able to get a lot of people involved and actually perform a siege or create a plan. And I think what Lenin is saying is that if you have a party that says, okay, we don't want ICE to exist, what we're going to do is have a series of attacks on these levels, and we've all decided that this is the best play, then you can, have a plan of attack that might actually function to strike a blow against them, rather than this sort of show of violence that results in basically an inconvenience for them.
Yeah, it's the ineffectiveness that Lenin is critiquing.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about terrorism right now is purely a question of efficacy, because it's not that it's not happening. There has been no one more active in terms of American domestic terrorism today than the right. How many mass shooters have popped up because they read a 4chan blog, and what did they accomplish?
Exactly.
There's a huge pushback on it. You're not really attacking the structures you need to attack. You're just kind of getting anger out. But the same thing too is that it's very appealing to the capitalist brain, because you don't have to do any organizing. You just need a lot of hustle.
It's very cathartic.
So if you read about stuff that pisses you off, it's the first thing you want to do. You're like, I'll go there and I'll blow them up, but you won't get anything done. So I don't know. You have to go send some emails.
It's an act of cathartic sort of desperation in lieu of any other levers to pull. And my co-host on Red Menace, Allison, pointed out the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front from the 90s. They did these basically. You could dispute whether it's terrorist or not. I think the American government is a terrorist organization, but leaving that question aside, what ultimately happened was, big agriculture didn't slow down. Animals weren't stopped being slaughtered. Climate change didn't cease, but those people that took part in it threw their lives away. They're still in prison, right? So what efficacy did it have? Lenin's older brother, right, did this exact thing. He engaged in in terrorism against, out of desperation and well-intention against a objectively brutal regime, and paid for it with his life without advancing the ball for his class and for oppressed people. But there is an element of propaganda of the deed, and I think that would be a defense that somebody on the more insurrectionary anarchist side might say. And you can look at somebody like Chris Dorner, right? He went off, and on one level
he certainly went off.
Now it didn't change anything, right? The LAPD is still fucking garbage, but but the question becomes, was it inspiring? Did it put seeds of new ideas in other people's heads? Did it enlarge your critique of policing in America? Those questions are sort of on the table. I'm sure for some people it did. I think all of us look at him with a little bit of admiration, right? Whether or not we're willing to admit it or not.
I would argue he birthed some very cool.
Johnson.
Also, say that again.
And Micah Xavier Johnson.
Yeah.
In Dallas.
Chris Dorner birthed a lot of really cool memes. That's something cool that came out of that.
And that's sort of my argument against that, is that it's a little bit fuzzy and idealist. And it's like, okay, yes, propaganda exists, but does it really shatter through? And especially nowadays, where every other day is a new, discourse on Twitter, and the news may or may not cover anything. I don't know if even literal murder is going to shoot through, like Michael Ronell happened. There was this whole argument of like this, Patriot Prayer killing, and then the cops just straight up murdered him. And was he an asset or not, or whatever? Like, who cares? It doesn't actually matter. It doesn't change anything. There's no propaganda. Nothing happened. Didn't change anybody's mind. So it's like, does it break through our consciousness? Not anymore. Maybe in Lenin's time, there was like some argument that like, planting a bomb at the White House would have like caused everyone to panic. But now it's sort of just like, well, whatever. I don't know. It doesn't affect me personally. And I don't think you're going to get people to like pay attention or like change their mind or really much of anything at this point.
Another thing about terrorism is that you can only do it once, So this is where I become kind of a little bit of sympathetic to fucking, a Woody Guthrie, this guitar kills fascists sort of thing. It's like, you probably get the same amount playing a song. Why don't you just do that 100 times,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think he's right in general, but there are like some exceptions where I've like felt the consciousness change. I mean, this particular thing I've been involved in wasn't I think anything that would be described as terrorism. But I remember when Eric Garner, when his killer was got off, there's all this movement in the streets in New York City, and all these people who showed up to protest, and you could just feel people discovering in real time the power that we choose to give the police, and actually taking a street, taking a bridge. The law is not a force of gravity. It's something that's invented, and just discovering that among people is very powerful. And I think that is kind of what happened in Minneapolis when they burned down the police precinct. Question is that sort of just going to remain among the cadre of people who comes out to protest, or is it going to have a ripple effect among the masses of the country? I think that's sort of an open question.
Off Jake's point real quick, I will say that if you are a committed socialist in America, the most helpful thing you could do is stay alive. For not very many of us. Don't die.
Yeah, like pandas.
I just wanted to add one more thing to this discussion too, because the irony is that sometimes such actions that could be labeled quote unquote terrorism actually do have something like a better impact and more efficacy, but it's actually only when they're tied to above ground organizations. And we can think of like the IRA car bombings, right? Or the Black Panther Party as the above ground organization, and the Black Liberation Army as the underground version of it. So when you actually have this above ground underground dynamic and it's connected to this broader party organizing, some of those criminal quote unquote activities can actually be more effective, precisely because they can then feed back in to the above ground rhetoric, propagandizing, and agitation. But in lieu of that, totally separated from that, it's just utterly, inefficacious.
Oh yeah, you got to have like a Stalin, like your underground mob boss guy running
Robin
around.
Banks.
Cracking skulls and commandeering steamboats from Mickey the Mouse and shit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we were talking about earlier with the DSA, is that I think that if they were running I think electoralism is totally fine. I don't think the Democratic Party itself has any sort of like revolutionary potential. And I think there should be a socialist electoral, entering that sort of parliamentarism if they're going to do it. But if it's connected to those things, then supporting each other, then you can have that thing. But if you only do one or the other, it kind of becomes every time you can always come back to like, if you separate people and you make people unable to communicate with each other, it's always going to be weaker. And I think that's kind of the point, Lenin's whole point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have one note about something Brett said. The ALF freed the giant pig in the movie Okja, if anyone's seen that.
Is that
I
true?
did see that. That was great.
It's a great movie. Bong Joon-ho.
Was that
Computer
pig.
animated? That was a real
That
animal.
was a real pig. Andrew.
Tiny pig, but they put the camera up close.
Wow.
Okay, so let's move on a little bit to the main concept that Lenin is working towards this whole time, which is the vanguard, which he doesn't really have a word for it yet, I think, when he writes this. But he's talking about building a party as opposed to just sort of assuming all this stuff will happen spontaneously. And that party sort of, the first step in making it, he sort of identifies as this thing that he calls professional revolutionaries, right? So the idea, I guess, would be that from the intelligentsia, you have people whose job is to sort of go down and organize with the workers. And then you also have workers that rise up, like we were talking about, earlier, and are able to sort of get their fucking theory on and read and sort of get a bigger picture for all this stuff and become, these specialized scions for the workers that they came out of. And that all together forms this team, this specific sort of unit of people that organize everything else out as a nexus. And that might sound kind of odd and kind of like you're putting a lot of work on, or a lot of pressure on a small group of people. But it's, first of all, I mean, this is proven to sort of work in the 1917 revolution. And also he sort of, looks at it and breaks down how you might say this is undemocratic, right? Maybe it is, but let's think about democracy. Is liberalism incredibly democratic? Is bourgeois liberalism? When somebody runs for mayor, is that fair? Is it, or how is that a lot different than when Che rises up out of the fucking muck and becomes Che or something like that?
Right.
He also contrasts it with like the idea I was talking about earlier, the co-op thing of a primitive organization. People saying, no, everyone should have the same fucking rights and everyone should have the same say or whatever. Well, that doesn't function very well, and it doesn't really do anyone any good to to put that much pressure on every single person. We talked about the division of labor earlier, in terms of there being a vanguard and that. And then I guess we'll maybe get to the newspaper next. I don't know, the parties. Anyone have anything to say about?
Yeah, I can start on this. One example of this, and I think it's really good, I enjoyed this, was John Steinbeck's novel In Dubious Battle. And what he does is he through fiction, right? He talks about how the Communist Party operated, and it's regular working class stiffs, right? They get recruited by the party. They come in, they can quit their job. They become funded by the party, right? They go out on these missions depending on where you're at. And another thing that they would be able to do was send organizers from the party into labor struggle. So when a labor struggle arose anywhere in the country, the professional revolutionaries from the Communist Party could be funded, could be sent down there in a caravan, not to go down and take over and dictate, right? But to talk with, to engage, to make these connections with other struggles around the country. And I think that's a really important thing to think. And through that novel, you get a clear idea of actually how that works on the individual level. But then also we can look back in American history at the early Communist Party USA before, their turn towards revisionism. I had an episode on Rev Left where we talked about the folk singers and the Bureau. And in that book, he explains how the Communist Party saw the rise of these folk singers, many of them, either black and oppressed for that, or come out of working class backgrounds and oppressed for that reason. And through their connections with the party, they began to use their music to advocate for, left-wing politics, pro-working class people, anti-racism, anti-fascism, etc. The Black Panther Party is another iteration of using this party sort of apparatus to effectively affect change. And when we look back over American history and we ask ourselves, what actually were the most effective left-wing movements, they're almost always going to think of things like the early Communist Party or the Black Panther Party right off the top of their head. And why is that? Well, precisely because they took this Leninist model of organizing incredibly seriously. And then when you get into professional revolutionaries, I always like to make this point whenever I talk about this, is you can think of somebody like Fred Hampton. Right. Fred Hampton did not become a leader because he was a careerist, because he played all the right moves and got to the top of an organization for his own personal ambitions. He rose precisely because he had organic confidence from the masses, from his community, which supported him. He rose organically, and his leadership was based on the trust and the confidence and the loyalty that the masses in his community had toward him. And that's precisely what Lenin, really goes to lengths to make clear, is this is not some tyrannical careerist move where leaders arise in this way, but it's wholly organic. And if you do not have good connections with the people you represent, with your other comrades, if you don't put in the work, you don't aspire, or you don't inspire that sort sort of loyalty and confidence in you. And so it really beats back this whole idea that Leninist organizing is a bunch of authoritarian wannabe tyrants trying to take over. No. In every instance where it's applied properly, we see organic risings like Rosa Luxemburg's, like Che Guevara's, like Fred Hampton's come to the top. And that's the strength of it.
Exactly. I don't know what else to say.
I wish we had a Vanguard party. It would be very nice.
Right. It's interesting.
That was my thought upon reading it.
It's so important. It's like, I mean, like when you listen to what it is, like when you listen to, like, again, the Black Panther Party, everybody likes the Black Panther Party. I don't, like, very few people are out here being like, the Black Panther Party was authoritarian or they're like, you know, elitist or whatever, because they clearly weren't. But this is what the Vanguard is. It's, you know, an organization of people that help their community and organize their community. And organize doesn't mean dictation. It doesn't mean you have to do this and we're controlling you. It means, hey, these are the problems. Here's how we're going to fix it. We all have these ideas, and like our job is to help you fix these problems in our community. And it's just so striking to me how easily people overlay inequality on people trying to fix problems. I don't know. It's bizarre.
Well, something that I find kind of interesting about this is that the professional revolutionary or the Vanguard, right? It kind of capitalists in the West in the Cold War and stuff like that often accuse communism of being this thing that turns people into homogenous automatons, worker ants, or something like that. But this is literally arguing like against that. It's saying, no, it doesn't make any sense. We're not going to indoctrinate every single person with the entire fucking thing. We're going to raise class consciousness, which is like a certain level of that. But actually, you know, you only really like you have specialization the same way we have in the professional thing in capitalism. Professional is like a really odd term to put on this. It kind of sounds like he's saying like we need PMC Stalin or something like that. But just because of our Twitter brains and shit like that. It is, you know, specialist is maybe a better word for it. But I mean that is something that, you know, regardless of probably government you know, tendency, fucking whatever system you want to go with, it's probably innate to like human nature. We as communities notice, oh, one of our guys is really good at math. We should fucking, you know, have him help us with this other thing. And somebody else is really good at, you know, whatever. Yeah. Alex knows a lot of it.
People organize almost naturally. Like they're like, oh, that guy's really good at fixing the road, or that guy's really good at doing my bills or whatever. You should be in charge of accounting. Like, nobody wants to do accounting. That guy loves accounting. Let him do it. Like it's a very simple idea that we all sort of arrive at when we are organized. That shouldn't. If you hear somebody sort of saying that this is somehow anti-democratic, I would just suggest not listening to them.
Well, I think part of the reason this sort of perception has arisen, I think, since Lenin passed on has to do with there have been quote unquote democratic centralist groups on the left that haven't really done, you know, as Brett was saying, they did not actually apply what he suggested correctly, and they have been sort of cultish, to use, you know, the certain Trotskyist groups, for instance, that have descended into cults and have been like minor, you know, tyrannies of you know 10 people. But the answer to that is not to become, as what a lot of the modern left has, and I think this is a problem too, totally horizontalist, where you don't have any decision-making capability and no like coherent program. I think there's got to be like a medium between the two.
And I think one of the greatest successes of anti-communism and ideology was convincing so many people, even on the left, that any form of organization or leadership is inherently authoritarian, right? And when you look at the enemies that we're facing, imperialism, fascism, capitalism itself, this is a highly organized, you know, disciplined, militant, funded, willing to use violence organization. And then they go around the world and they say, yeah, but communists, when they do it, that's authoritarian and that's scary. And leftists actually buy into it. Mm-hmm. And so you have this suspicion on the left, particularly on the American left, where we're taught libertarianism and liberalism our entire lives, individualism, of any sort of effective organization and leadership, and it hinders our movements so entirely. And it's like, if you look at your enemy and you want to take them on, what do they have? Well, they have organization. Like I said, they have the discipline, they have the funding. Well, don't we need to match that in order to meet them? Or can we defeat that by eschewing leadership, eschewing organization, insisting that the 17-year-old who comes into our meeting has every bit as much to say as a Fred Hampton who's been organizing for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
These are things that kill the left. And the fact that the left buys into it is a success of anti-communist ideology.
The 17-year-old is like, we're going to lower the drinking age. It's like the only issue.
Chill.
I do think we should do that, though. It's important to do.
Yeah, it is funny. Everybody has this, like, when you're 17, that's the most important issue in the world. And then
Yeah. We need to democratize girlfriends. We need to have that discourse for five months.
Y'all aren't ready for that conversation.
Another aspect of this that I think is maybe more specific to Lenin's time is that he was in a secret organization. So how democratic is it going to be? It might be, you might elect leaders within a secret organization, but it's only, I mean, the goal is to be working on behalf of people that are outside of the organization, right? So functionally, it doesn't really make any sense to try to apply like this sort of liberal bourgeois democratic process to it. What you have to do is really probably cultivate the actual organic democracy that's going to come out of just like working together with people or whatever. And that's, maybe a little controversial. Hey,
but lots of people I mean, that's the thing. It's like you can't like Robert's rules, like everybody clap if you want Stalin to rob a bank. Like he's gonna do it.
Everyone snap and use his pronouns.
Don't clap. Stalin hates that.
That's a really good argument for things being secret. Do not broadcast shit. Deal with it inside.
So the thing that he kind of rounds out on and culminates all this with is the newspaper, which we haven't even talked about, but his newspaper was called Iskra, that means the spark, and he was beefing with a few other newspapers in this, in this.
It was to attract smokers.
Yeah. So one thing that he sort of talks about is really specific to the time, but it's kind of interesting, which is that he's arguing that there needs to be a national newspaper, not a bunch of little syndicalized individual local newspapers, because at the time the newspaper was the medium of transferring information. So it was really important that this thing be kind of standardized. And he goes into all how, like, when you have a local newspaper, it only comes out twice a year, and then no one reads it and all this shit, and you need to make Jacobin and all this fucking crap. And he also argues that this newspaper, as like an organizing tool, will give birth to this party he's talking about, not the other way around, which is something that the economists sort of argue, is that like, no, you just start a party and then the party makes a newspaper, right?
This is the thing that podcasters hate to talk about.
Yeah, it's really boring.
Because I do think that like what Lenin is saying, and I think you're right, is that what Lenin is saying is that the information and the structure has to inform, we have to have everybody sort of on the same page so that as a party is formed, it is of like the ideals of what we're talking about. And we have to assume that if Lenin was talking about 2020, he would be talking about a different form. And whether it's YouTubes or podcasts or Medium posts, Substacks, I'm not really sure. Yeah. But like whatever it is, we don't have it. Like we don't have one of these. And a lot of Leninists aren't even interested in making one. Like it's very rare that I hear anybody talking about like organizing media people to have a line, like a political, ideological line that we propose to everyone, and we are all agreeing that this is what we're saying and this is what we're proposing. Nobody we can't even organize ourselves as media people.
Do you remember last year when I think Nathan Robinson proposed a left like cable news network and everybody got his ass on Twitter about it?
Yeah, I do remember that.
I mean, I understand there's that wouldn't work probably, but it's like at least he's trying. Yeah, no one has an answer for this problem.
Got a lot of ideas under that wide hat.
It is funny too how some like Marxists are almost like constitutional originalists with Lenin. They're like, no, it has to literally be a newspaper.
That's the Trotskyist shit, where it's like, they're going to give you this international newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is too sort of like it's an uncomfortable topic for podcasters too, because there's something sort of like that can come off as immodest or self-aggrandizing in saying that like we are responsible for educating the masses, but in a way it's sort of true. It's just everybody together, and it can't be just the media you create, right? That should also be grounded in material work.
Right, and I think it's brain poisoning from Jon Stewart. Like there's a certain American individualist understanding that like we're comedians, we aren't actually doing politics. Obviously, this episode would be absurd to say that, but like there's this thing.
The funniest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, but I think there's this thing where it's like people are afraid to say we're doing politics and we're all of a piece and we should all get. At least people who can claim to be communists should be agreeing that we should all be working together and building each other up. And that seems sort of stupid and foolish for some reason. And I'm not sure what the mental kind of gymnastics people have to do to get to that point. But I do think that that's incredibly important, not just podcasters, but, people who have Substacks, people who have big Twitter, like people who are reaching people, whatever it is. You're not going to get famous by yourself. That's not. We shouldn't be striving to become the next Jon Stewart. We should be organizing ourselves to getting points across.
Right, and I think that's an important point, and some of that has to do with the self-effacement of like sort of sort of a hangover from like the late '90s, like anti-brand. You don't want to seem like a media opportunist. But I always think of this quote that that sort of goes to that point, tries to deflate the power of satire or media when they'll say like, well, there are all these satirists in Weimar Germany. And none of them stopped, and they were writing all these pieces against Hitler, but they didn't stop him from rising to power. It's like, yeah, that's true, but somebody came and took Hitler, beat his ass, right? Somebody beat the Nazi army, and there were a lot of propagandists in Soviet Russia, in the US, and the UK who were making that possible, because you can't really change much of anything until you change the ideas in people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's like almost like the circular logic of the tactics as planned thing. Like some things are part of it, but aren't the entirety of the revolution,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another way to view this position is Lenin just taking what he's applying to organizing and applying it to like the propaganda outlets, right? We need that level of organization and that coordination in order to make these things work. And I think one of, speaking of podcasts, one of the things that actually makes podcasts not only superior to newspapers, but to these other forms of new media, I think, and this is certainly why I got into it, is because you can actually listen at work. Unlike a YouTube video where you have to watch or something you have to read, I got into podcasts by working shitty dishwashing jobs and delivering pizzas, but always having my earbuds in, listening to stuff. And I became educated on a bunch of different things, including politics, mostly through that, because I didn't have much of time outside of my work life to sit down and read through anything, or sit down for 5 hours and watch a YouTube lecture or something like that. And the other thing I wanted to point out is how social media is the antithesis of this, right? The very incentives, algorithms inherent in social media work against any sort of coherence, any sort of coordinating. It shatters epistemologies, creates little epistemological silos that we sit in. You can't break out. You can't reach people outside of those already existing echo chambers. And so I think the more time you spend on these platforms, the further away we get towards these sorts of things. And I think the more individualism springs up. It's like, I have my own Twitter page. I'm going to give my own opinions, my own eclectic collection of ideas that I personally prefer. And we're going to go to battle with your preferred ideas. And that just gets nowhere. It's spinning your tires in the mud. And part of the genius of these platforms is precisely that they work as a secondary function, as the co-option mechanisms,
Yeah, they're atomization factories that like masquerade as tying people, connecting you.
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
what I mean? But you're not being connected. You're being pitted against each other. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. Podcasts, I think, are very superior to reading. And I think one of the things that's, reading this book, honestly, I would much rather send somebody, like if there was a YouTube video or a podcast that like just explains, I mean, I know a couple, Marx Madness, Red Menace, do this thing, which is like, maybe it's actually better to listen to somebody explain to you what is to be done than actually sit down and read it and have to go through Wikipedia and figure out who the Mensheviks were and who like the fucking workers' cause newspaper was all about. Like, he doesn't really explain that in here. You have to do that work. So having somebody do the work of, people are ashamed to say they were radicalized or they're educated through podcasts, but like lots of fucking people are.
But it's even in the theory that we're reading that there's like a fucking argument about this. People work 11 hours a day. Sometimes they can't, sit and read theory all day. Reading theory is a pain in the ass.
It really is.
And also, sometimes people are nerds about it, and they're like, I read it and it gave me a headache, which means I learned it harder. And it's like, no, you just fucking used a piece of media that is more difficult to take in,
And also, like, theory, as we're talking about here, like, this is theory, which is literally a polemic. It's really just somebody like arguing on Twitter or on it's the podcast of that time.
Yeah.
And it's literally just, it's not, because it's funny when people talk about theory, I think of like throughout my childhood or like teenage adolescence or whatever, I read a lot of philosophy.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's very like, it's theory in the sense of like, this is what is real, and we're talking about like logic gates and talking about like, can we prove this and stuff. This is not that. This is like, is this stupid or is it not based on our morality? It's just arguments. And everyone has the capacity to read arguments or hear arguments.
For the last month, we've been talking about how Uber won an election. They essentially had no business winning, crushed it out of the park by essentially putting their propaganda in their app and making you interact with it. Capitalists are using all the technology to have very fancy newspapers. We just need to gamify communist agitation.
Yeah.
You light a police precinct on fire. That gets you 4 points. I don't know what kind of rewards that unlocks. Maybe that's something we can discuss.
Yeah, if you would get 1,000 points, you become a professional revolutionary.
I want it so bad.
But seriously, I think that this is a really important, I think the newspaper part of this book is very important. I mean, understanding that we need a vanguard party and understanding what a vanguard party is and why we need it is really important. And I think what a lot of people take away from this, but like I said before, we've lived in 100 years of propaganda, like Edward Bernays, the Nazis, America, like we should have understood how important that stuff is now. And like, there are spots of people trying to I guess the left podcast scene has been around for about 4 or 5 years now. So like, it's still nascent or whatever, Means TV is trying something, like lots of different people are trying things. But I think that we should be taking that just as seriously as the concept of a vanguard party and why they're deeply interrelated.
Yeah, so I don't want to keep everyone too long. I know we have to get out of here, and also my head hurts because this is the smartest episode we've ever done on this show. We need to get back to talking about fucking anime and shit. So I think
do a Santa episode.
Yeah.
That's the next one.
And the media question is huge, and I think it's kind of the $1 million question, and I think it's also something that you can't really just look backwards and then when we're talking about technology, you're not going to look at something 100 years ago and find a fucking perfect copy and solution to this. It's something that we can talk about like a lot, and there isn't one big thing. I don't know. I guess, Brett, do you have any notes on that before we kind of close this out, or you want to just kind of go?
Yeah, no, I'm ready to close out. I think we touched on all the main points of this text, absolutely. And as like Brynn alluded to, we do have an episode on Red Menace. It's called "What Is to Be Done," and we literally just walk you through the text and then reflect on it. So if you like this discussion and want to dive even deeper, you could always go check that out as well.
Absolutely, I listened to it. It's great.
It was so helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Listen to Red Menace to do exactly what Brett was talking about. I mean, I did the same fucking thing. I listened to so much shit on headphones while I was working. It changed my life. Yeah. It's crazy. You don't have time scarcity with learning shit. We'll go off on a different episode. Let's do.
Yes, a lot of stuff I learned from Rev Left Radio while as a courier for Try Caviar. So kudos to you, Brett.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think we're all big fans. So thank you for joining us. Brett, go ahead and plug where my listeners can listen to all your stuff.
Yeah, if you want to find Red Menace or Rev Left, just go to revolutionaryleftradio.com. And we have a new project, a couple episodes out, called Guerrilla History, where we do for history what we do for political theory on Red Menace, which is basically just more advanced deep dives. So that's where you can find me.
Cool. And Brynn Nieboer.
You can find my podcast wherever you find podcasts or whatever you find this podcast. One is called BP Lettuce. One is called Generation Loss with Jeremy Hammond from Ballin' Out Super. That's about movies. We both have Patreons. I also stream sometimes on Twitch, twitch.tv/Dolcare, which are generally more deep dives about parapolitics and interviews with people like Matt Christman and Michael S. Judge about like the functioning imperial state. It's not video games. But other than that, I think that's all I do.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
At Anders Lee here on Twitter, Dursley on Instagram. Check out Redacted Tonight, my other job on YouTube and portable.tv. And I would also like to plug the new Vanguard, John Ossoff, who's running for Senate in Georgia. Everyone should no, in all seriousness, there is a project that is, I think, really cool, has a lot of potential. That is a workers' cooperative for drivers in New York City who are trying to, fight back against Uber and the Lyfts of the world. And we'll link to the place where you can donate, but it's ioby.org. It's NYC Drivers Launch Platform Cooperative. We'll link to it. Check it out. They're trying to raise $20,000 and they've already passed one goal and they're about to hit another one. So it's very cool.
Awesome.
As for me, if this discussion on Lenin's work has you at all interested in centralized power and its applications, you may be interested in learning more about Goku, the strongest Saiyan ever to live. And you can hear more about him on my comedy podcast, Ballin' Out Super, and listen to my radio drama, Theater of Delights, which Brynn does the music for, season 2, dropping soon.
All right, my other show is called Why You Mad? It's me and my art historian, anthropologist friend, Luis Diaz. We talk about art history, philosophy, pop culture, books, all sorts of shit. Oh, and stand-up. That is the main through line. We have new merch. If you're listening to our show, regular one, it'll be out soon. We made a new logo. You'll see it.
There's rats.
There's rats on it.
Oh,
yeah, sign up for our Patreon for bonus episodes, and I think that's it. I'm banned from Twitter. I'll tweet out the episode in 3 days when it comes out, but you'll probably hear this from someone else. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys very much for joining us. We end our show by saying it's finished.
It's finished.
It's finished.
It's finished.
It's finished.
Hey, that was fun. I got them to do it. All right.